Okay, let's start. Hi, everyone from Canberra here in Ngunnawal country. Thanks so very much for joining us. We have today a very special guest, Professor William Maley, the twin brother of Michael. While Michael's a legend in the electoral world, William is a legend in the academic one, known probably to most for his work on and in Afghanistan, but his finger is in many pies. Today, he's going to riff off some themes from his latest book, Australia, the Politics of a Degraded Democracy. In the context of democratic institutions under stress around the world, William's talk will, I believe, deal with the particular structural forces driving political dysfunction here in Australia, not in electoral administration, but mostly within the parties. Professor Maley will talk for about half an hour, during which you might feel like writing questions or comments in the text section here in Zoom. After he's finished, I'll attempt to triage and consolidate those contributions and verbally deliver them to him. And during that last section, attendees should feel free to put up their Zoom hands if they wish to say or ask something in person on the screen that's relevant to the recent or the current discussion. They can also continue to write questions. Will this arrangement work? We'll see. And in case you haven't noticed, we are recording this. So I will now hand over to Bill. Take it away, Professor.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you today and to share some reflections which flow in part from the book that I've just published, but also from nearly 50 years of interest in electoral processes and how they contribute to Australian political life. One of the factors that prompted me to write this book is that I'm now retired, an emeritus professor rather than a serving professor. Emeritus simply means superannuated. But it does give one the opportunity to bring together reflections on themes and issues which may have been prominent in public discussion, but remote from the particular areas on which one might have been conducting research whilst employed by a university. Having said that, my interest in elections goes back to the early 1970s, when I actually bought in 1973 a copy of Malcolm Mackerriss's book, Australian General Elections, although my interest in politics stretches back to the early 60s for reasons that I outline in the introduction to the book itself. What I want to do today is three things. I want to give some background to the concerns which prompted me to draft this book in the first place. I then want to say a little bit about the electoral dimensions of degraded democracy, although the thrust of my argument in the book is that electoral administration in Australia is not a source of challenges for the integrity of the democratic system, although there are certain features of electoral processes which, when coming together, can have effects on other parts of the political system that may be undesirable. And then I'll conclude with some comments that summarize briefly some of the broader themes within the bulk of the book, which together suggest that we do need to be vigilant about the circumstances that confront Australian democracy at present, even though, as I argue in the book, we're not facing a democratic crisis in Australia in the way that a number of other countries certainly have in recent times. So let me begin with some opening background. And a consideration that triggered my concern to write a book about this was data from the Australian election study, which showed that although satisfaction with democracy appeared to remain high, when one came to look at the issues of trust, something on which I've written in other circumstances, there were some alarming figures coming to the surface. And there are two particular statistics from the 2022 Australian election study, which I share here. One was that 70% of respondents while 70% of respondents expressed themselves satisfied with the way democracy worked in Australia. When queried about trust, 70% of respondents felt that people in government were too often interested in looking after themselves, and only 30% felt that people in government could be trusted to do the right thing nearly all the time. And 54% felt that government was run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, whilst only 12% felt that it was run for the benefit of all the people. And when one sees figures of that sort, one begins to wonder about the ways in which the political system is responding to expectations from the public, and whether the functioning of democracy in Australia is quite as robust as the more general statements recorded in the Australian election study would suggest, because there's always a risk that people's responses to very broad questions about democracy may blur understandings about the functioning of a particular democratic system with a sense of the desirability of democracy as a political system more broadly. In the book, I then try to unpack to some degree different ideas about democracy, and ranging from delegative to representative to deliberative to participatory to liberal democracy. And these different models that have been advanced by academics do create different sorts of expectations of what a particular system will deliver. And it is quite a useful spectrum by which one can try to locate different systems. The United States system is certainly looking much more delegative at the moment. That some features of that system do seem to differentiate itself from the Australian system, which still seems to be much more in the representative camp than the deliberative or the participatory, although there have been exercises in the past, such as the deliberative discussions that preceded the Republic vote in the late 1990s that have had deliberative dimensions. I also distinguish between different sorts of structures within democratic systems, particularly noting the variation between presidential systems on the one hand and parliamentary systems on the other hand, and unitary and federal systems, because depending upon the particular structures that have been adopted in an individual state, one may have different challenges that arise. And of course, there may be a diversity of electoral mechanisms and electoral administrations, which are also at play in shaping people's perceptions of how a democratic system is functioning. Probably the most important distinction that I try to draw at the outset is between the idea of a democratic crisis and the idea of democratic degradation. And the broader argument of the book is that Australia is not facing a democratic crisis if by crisis one understands a fundamental turning point where things can either improve or things can dramatically deteriorate, which is an idea that comes from medicine as much as any other areas. But I do think Australia is facing a situation in which institutions on which people have come to rely in the political sphere are not functioning in the ways that people might hope. And it seemed to me that the idea of degradation was something that better captured this than a simple binary that posited either a system that was functioning reasonably well or a system that was in crisis. There are subtle midpoints between those two extremes, which in the book I argue better capture some aspects of the way in which the Australian system is functioning. Essentially, the Australian system still is a Westminster variant, although there are aspects of the political system which differ from Parliament at Westminster, notably the existence of a codified constitution dividing powers between the Commonwealth and the states that create opportunities for judicial ruling on the distribution of powers and the interpretation of those provisions within the Constitution. The broader argument that arises when I'm talking about electoral issues is that we need, instead of looking at particular measures or practices on their own, to think also about how the interaction of different policies or legal provisions may create unintended consequences and dysfunctional incentives. I don't think it's a particular exaggeration of social science to say that ever since Robert Merton's 1936 article on the unintended consequences of purposive social action, there's been an understanding that steps that might seem desirable or innocuous in themselves may have different consequences when they exist in parallel with other measures that may also seem to be desirable or innocuous. And I'll come back to that when I talk about electoral funding in just a moment. Let me go on to say something about elections, because I understand, of course, that that's a primary preoccupation, and legitimately so, of people in the ERRN. I've had a long-standing interest in that, and wandering down memory lane, I found an article I actually published 42 years ago in the old Current Affairs Bulletin on federal electoral reform issues and arguments. And I was also involved in the Australian Electoral Office for 3 months in 1983 with Jan Woodward, drafting the submission on public funding that was presented to the Joint Select Committee on Electoral Matters or Electoral Reform, arising from the change of government that occurred when the Fraser government was replaced by the Hawke government. It's nonetheless worth noting that electoral reform is very often a rolling agenda rather than a moment in time. And where public funding was concerned, there had been a major report authored by Sir Clarence Harders on electoral expenditure, which was actually commissioned by Kevin Newman, the Minister for Administrative Services, father of Campbell Newman, during the last months of the Fraser government. And something that struck me was that many of the issues that are pertinent for discussion these days were issues which were also being discussed more than 40 years ago. And in a sense, that suggests to me that the design and the implementation of electoral structures and electoral policies will never be, as it were, a finalized agenda, because different measures will have different political consequences. That's something we've understood since Douglas Ray published his 1967 book on the political consequences of electoral laws. But there will also be feedback from the ways in which systems actually function once they've been implemented. And that, I think, is important when one thinks about unintended consequences, because there have been a number of reforms which have had more consequences than the authors may have anticipated. And I just wanted in the abstract to mention 3 areas of electoral reform here that are important in this respect. One relates to the size of the parliament. Of course, there have been 2 really significant expansions in the size of the parliament in 1948 and then in 1984, with the House of Representatives expanding from 75 to 122 and then to 150 for the 2025 election, and with the Senate moving from 36 to 60 and then 64 with the territory senators and then 76 as a result of the expansions. Now, when these expansions occurred, there was a lot of discussion about what the ramifications might be, but there were some ramifications which, from my memory, were not as much canvassed at the time as one might have expected. And this was in part because of the change of electoral system in the Senate in 1948, which brought in for the 49 election and subsequently a proportional representation system. And the combination of an expanded parliament and a proportional representation system of the kind that's used for electing the Senate has meant that it has become increasingly unlikely that a government with a majority in the House of Representatives will also command a majority within the Senate. And in fact, for only 3 years of the last 43 has that been the case. And so when we talk about the possibility of minority government after the 2025 election, it's worth bearing in mind that governments have had to negotiate their way through a legislative chamber in which they don't enjoy an absolute majority for much of the last 4 decades. And that seems unlikely to change. Another area where this has arisen is within the sphere of public funding. And when Jan Woolwood and I drafted the Electoral Office submission to the Joint Select Committee back in 1984, we did so without an enormous amount of optimism about
sorry, let me just make sure I can
that
turn
were being
the sound
made
on.
about the likely consequences that would flow from
Muted at the moment.
amendments.
Where's the...
And the developments since then, I think, have vindicated the sense of skepticism that we felt at the time, that the belief that the consequence of public funding would be to prevent the influence of large sums of grey, if not black money on the political system, were not necessarily going to be vindicated. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. One of the most encouraging aspects of the Australian political system, in a sense running against some of the tendencies that have worried me in recent times, have arisen from the establishment by statute of the Australian Electoral Commission as a transparent and independent body. And if one thinks back to events such as the Royal Commission on the naming of electorates, which led to the exit of Senator Withers from the Fraser ministry, or the risk that redistributions would be disallowed by the Parliament, one begins to sense just what a change in the character of the wider electoral framework has been produced by the establishment of a credible and transparent electoral body such as the AEC. And there, I think it's important to recognise that this is something which is precious, but it is also potentially fragile. One of the things that I found disturbing in the during the period of the constitutional alteration referendum on the voice was the way in which some opponents of the voice tried to insinuate that potential voters were being manipulated by teams from the Australian Electoral Commission, a claim for which no credible evidence was ever produced, but which could be a warning sign that losers at some point in the future, or people whose claims to speak for an electorate that doesn't actually support their positions, may see traducing the electoral administration as a device by which they can advance their political objectives. This has, in a sense, been avoided in the past because of two factors that became very clear at the time of the loss of ballot papers for the Western Australian Senate election. One was the transparency of the Electoral Commission about what had happened, and the other was the willingness of figures such as the Australian Electoral Commissioner to resign, something which one doesn't see nearly as frequently from ministers as one might like to see if one were hoping to give substance to the idea of accountability. So that's been, I think, a very positive development. A comment I wanted to make in passing about the expansion of the Parliament is that the increasing power, the lowering of the quota for Senate elections, both in a double dissolution and in a half Senate election, has had the effect of weakening the appeal of a double dissolution under Section 57 as a way of breaking a deadlock between the House of Representatives and the Senate, because with a larger Senate and a lower quota, the likelihood even that a double dissolution will produce an outcome which will allow legislation to be taken to signature by the Governor-General has really gone down. And this was the experience that Malcolm Turnbull had when he called a double dissolution. And I suspect that will cast a long shadow in the future. So although it took a long time for double dissolutions to kick off, I think they may be in a dying phase at the moment. But there's no doubt that we're looking at a situation in which minority power is increasingly likely to be exercised through the Senate. And if after the next election there is a minority government in the House of Representatives as well, it will be interesting to see to what extent the experiences of dealing with minor parties and independents in the Senate will then translate happily or congenially into the House of Representatives environment as well. That's, I think, one of the most intriguing things that we're witnessing at the moment. There was one comment I also wanted to make about a change that had an unintended consequence that has not been much discussed, and that was the change in the Constitution that flowed from the referendum that changed the mechanism for filling casual vacancies in the Senate in order to give political parties a role in determining the selection of somebody to replace a deceased or resigned senator. This, of course, was a product of the circumstances that surrounded the appointment of Cleaver Bunton by New South Wales Premier Tom Lewis to the Senate after the resignation of Senator Murphy to go to the High Court, and also the appointment of Albert Patrick Field as a senator by Premier Bjelke Petersen, a renegade Labor figure after the death of Senator Bertie Milliner. The new system has created an environment in which the cost to the political parties of a Senate resignation will be virtually zero. Between 1949 and 1977, there were only 7 resignations from the Senate because of the rightly perceived risk that this could give rise to a situation in which, if there were a half Senate election for 6 rather than 5 senators, it might affect the numbers within the Senate. Since 1977, there have been over 100 resignations from the Senate, with people being routinely replaced by nominees of the party from which the resigned senator came. Most recently, Senator Simon Birmingham. Now, one of the consequences of this has been that whereas previously there were a very large number of senators who had served in the Senate for a very considerable period of time and got to know each other, and to some degree arguably absorbed certain norms of behaviour with respect to the operation of the chamber, now there is much more rapid turnover in the membership of the Senate. And prima facie, one might expect that a consequence of this would be that people within the Senate would be less assimilated to particular norms of behaviour that might have made the Senate a more deliberative chamber than in the past. And certainly, impressionistically, at least, if one listens to parliamentary broadcasts these days, the Senate has now become just as rowdy and raucous a chamber as the House of Representatives used to be, perhaps because senators are looking to establish their rowdiness as credentials for future pre-selection for the House of Representatives. But it does change the way in which the Senate has functioned. And the final electoral point that I specifically wanted to mention related to the issue I raised earlier about the confluence of measures that might in themselves be apparently innocuous. And here I discuss in the book the way in which the confluence of compulsory voting and public funding has actually changed the incentive structures which political parties face. Historically, parties that required mass memberships did so for several reasons. One was to be able to mobilise voters to go out and vote in a situation where there was not compulsory voting, guaranteeing a large turnout. And if one looks at what happened in the British election that saw Sir Keir Starmer come to power, it's very clear that there was an enormous amount of this kind of canvassing being carried out by teams of local branch members in order to ensure a high turnout. That's not necessary in Australia. members are not required in order to do that. Similarly, if you have upwards of $75 million being paid out after an election in public funding, with the bulk going to the major political parties, that will be more than sufficient to cover the core operating expenses of the party bureaucracies. And when that's the case, the parties don't actually rely on members anymore to raise those kinds of funds. You're not going to raise that kind of money through chook raffles and those kind of activities. And this, I think, has led to a situation over time where big money is still there because it's required to fund some aspects of electronic campaigning, but it's not coming from the mass membership of parties anymore to an appreciable degree. It's coming from the very sources that back in 1983-84, people were hoping public funding would choke off as significant sources of influence on the way in which parties function. And I tell a number of stories in the book about a practice which particularly alarms me, which is rich people being able to pay $20,000 for a seat at a dinner table with the Prime Minister. There's an entertaining story there where Mr. Abbott went to Perth for one of these dinners, but a number of the contributors, although they were prepared to put up the money, didn't want to be seen with Mr. Abbott. And this threatened an attendance at the dinner that was so low that the party organisation then cut in half the price that was being asked for attendance, from $20,000 to $10,000, at which the people who'd paid $20,000 then furiously demanded their money back, wisely. But this suggests that public funding as a device for doing away with special access or sinister interest has not necessarily worked especially well. More broadly, if you actually don't need members to raise your operating expenses and you don't need members to get the vote out, you probably don't need members at all. This is a point that Michael Yabsley has made, but it's also been made on the other side of politics by Barry Jones, who referred to public funding and compulsory voting as bomb shelters protecting the major parties from the discontent of members of the electorate. The danger, if parties cease to be mass organisations in any really meaningful sense, is that they will instead divert to patronage networks, and I'll come up to that in just a moment. Those are the key points that I want to make on the electoral side, but I'll briefly flag a number of other points very superficially with which the book is concerned, and then open for discussion. The first point I'd make, of course, is that we do need to be wary of reductionism in this area, because there are always a diversity of causal factors that contribute to things like degradation, whether we're talking about party systems, whether we're talking about parliamentary institutions, whether we're talking about bureaucracy, those kind of things. What I've sought to do in the book is not pick up every single factor that might be relevant, because that would lead to a much larger book, but instead highlight some developments which seem to me to have been notably significant in contributing to some of the problems that we face. One element is, I think, the decline of Parliament. There is simply so much legislation being put to Parliament these days that it is utterly unrealistic to think that people who are voting on the legislation are actually across the content. And that may not be too worrying until you get measures sailing through the Parliament that actually impact very detrimentally on the liberty of the subject. And I cite a very tragic case of a piece of migration legislation which meant that a person failed the character test under the Migration Act if they had committed any offence in immigration detention, whether it was murder or whether it was littering. And the particular case was one of an Iranian asylum seeker who was charged with a very minor act of affray, which you could actually watch on a YouTube clip, which was the kind of confrontation you'd see outside every pub on a Friday night, for which he was then convicted of assault by a magistrate who was later herself forced to resign because of misconduct. He was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. The Court of Appeal overturned the conviction on the basis that, not the conviction, the penalty on the basis that it was manifestly excessive, but they didn't overturn the conviction. He was then trapped by the Migration Act and in effect given a life sentence to a detention centre, from which he escaped and then almost certainly committed suicide. And one of his friends said, he's free now, God gave him a visa. Now, I went back and had a look at the legislative history of the measure, and it went through both houses of Parliament with scarcely a comment being made. The only person who raised concerns about its possible ramifications was Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. No one paid any attention to what she'd said. So whilst it may simply be the way of the world that members of Parliament are not reading in detail the legislation on which they're voting, it's something which can have real-world ramifications for vulnerable people. One of the consequences of the establishment of major parties increasingly as patronage networks is that often the best and the brightest are not seeking to become candidates, but also that the pathway towards elite recruitment is increasingly through student politics, ministers' offices, and network building as a result of the opportunities that presence in ministers' offices can create. And a study that was actually done by Jan Pakulski and Brian Tranter suggested that whereas in the late 1960s, about 6% of people who were elected to the Senate and House of Representatives had as their principal prior occupation working as ministerial staffers or staffers for MPs. By 2015, when they did their study, this had increased to over 40%. And it's interesting that both Sir Robert Menzies and also John Howard, who made the same point at a talk that I attended recently, argued that the best outcome for a parliament was if the people who were elected already had records of achievement in a prior life before they came into the parliament itself. And I think there's a lot to be said for that particular line of argument. As a kind of passing point here, I'd note that one of the consequences of the expansion of the Senate and House of Representatives in 1948 was that at the 1949 election, there were a very large number of vacant seats with no incumbents in both chambers. And it's pretty clear, not least from a detailed study that was done recently by the Parliamentary Library by one of my former students, that having a record of honourable war service was one of the factors that contributed to success in pre-selection for the 1949 election. And quite a number of those members elected in 1949 were still in the Senate and the House of Representatives in the 1970s and in a couple of cases even into the early 1980s. And an implication of this was that one had really across the chambers people who had the experience of serving a higher cause than just a political party. And it's very difficult to pin down the exact consequences of this, but my impressionistic sense is that combined with the architecture of the old Parliament House, where members from different sides were bumping into each other all the time and socialising together, it contributed to a rather different kind of atmospheric within Parliament from that which one has encountered in the new building since 1988, when the entry hall is like a station from the Moscow Metro, and the senators and members have huge suites of offices which are almost self-contained beehives where people gather and plot. The problem of ministerial conduct is also one that's troubled me, really. The notion of the sin bin, where people who've really misbehaved are sort of put on the backbench for a while and then brought back into the ministry fairly rapidly, was not one I think that one found around floating around in the Menzies era. And it does tend to loosen the constraints on ministerial behaviour if they feel that there's going to be no real long-run penalty for actions that members of the general public might find fairly appalling. And I cite the case of Senator Bridget McKenzie, tipped out of the ministry because of a conflict of interest in granting, but back in the ministry virtually in no time at all, and with a seemingly unimpeded political career. And if one begins to ask why members of the public might feel dissatisfied with the performance of members of parliament, one only needs a few examples of this kind in order to begin to create a critical mass of discontent. And if you ally this with a relatively weak National Anti-Corruption Commission that doesn't hold public hearings at all, you've got potentially a problem on your hands. Allied to this has been the really detrimental consequences of the Members of Parliament Staff Act of 1984, which took the bulk of parliamentary staffers out of the remit of the Public Service Act and instead gave members and senators great power over the selection of personal staff, which of course created vulnerabilities on the part of that staff cohort and set the scene for some of the abusive patterns of behaviour that were documented in the Jenkins report after the case of Brittany Higgins and Bruce Lehrmann came to light. I was also struck at the time of the Lehrmann-Higgins case by how young these people were. And anyone who sits at the entrance of one of the parliamentary entrances early on the morning of a sitting week will see people who are barely out of their teens walking into Parliament House with passes to be working in members' offices. And this is a very different world from that which existed in the 50s and 60s when there simply wasn't the space for Parliament House to accommodate such brats, to put it gently, and people came out of public service departments to engage with ministers or members who needed assistance of different sorts. So in that sense, and I discuss this in great detail in the book, the Members of Parliament Staff Act, I think, has had a detrimental effect, not least because public servants in ministers' offices are very good at keeping ministers out of trouble in a way that people playing out student politics and using Parliament House as a playpen are probably not going to be capable of doing to a great degree. I also talk about the hollowing out of the public service through managerialism and discuss in some detail the Robodebt Royal Commission report and its lessons, and also the case of Mr. Pizzullo and his removal from the position of Secretary of the Home Affairs Department. And there had been some suggestion with changes in the Public Service Act brought in by John Dawkins in 1984 that this would actually lead to the disappearance of mandarins of the kind that had famously been labelled the seven dwarfs in the 1950s and the 1960s, and the provision of departmental secretaries whose views would be attuned to those of the government of the day. But the Pizzullo case, I think, suggests that empire building can still go on and be pursued very actively by public servants, although the risk of getting caught out can be pretty great these days as well. I also talk in a distinct chapter about problems arising from contempt for the rule of law, and we've seen that through attempts to put privative clauses into the Migration Act to prevent courts from reviewing decisions taken by ministers and public servants to ensure that they accord with the provisions of statute and law. And that particular attempt came unstuck because of a decision by the High Court that a decision contaminated by jurisdictional error was no decision at all and therefore not protected by a privative clause. But there have also been problems of secrecy. The current government is clearly a very secretive one indeed, and patterns of fairly gross misbehaviour, such as the use of statute to protect the people who bugged the cabinet room of Timor-Leste. And I remember at the time people were saying, well, everyone does this, but of course Timor-Leste has not bugged the cabinet room of the Australian government. I then have a chapter which looks at media power, particularly social media, disinformation and the problems of legislating for truth in advertising. And there are all sorts of little legal complexities that can arise if one's trying to create offences that can be prosecuted in this particular area. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about that. And then I conclude with some discussion of some longer term challenges, really on the demand side, where the operation of the political system is concerned, where institutions more broadly are themselves under stress, institutions like banking systems, universities, even the family, with massive change taking place, not necessarily pointing to a broader environment of crisis, but throwing up an environment of uncertainty with which the political system may need to cope. Then I have some discussion of some areas of policy where it can be very tempting for a government in the here and now simply to say, after me the deluge, and leave these issues for a future government to address, even though the problems of managing the issues are likely to compound with the passage of time. And they're developing effective revenue bases for the state, managing challenges of climate change, addressing issues of housing and housing affordability, and also the challenges of an aging population are some of these longer term issues that really require a certain amount of cooperation within political circles if one isn't to stagger from short-term measures to short-term measures with sensible long-term measures being shot down for political gain by oppositions. And that leads me to the concluding point that I make in the book. I think there has been a drift towards a notion of Australian politics as war. And we saw this actually after the Dunkley by-election, when a Liberal member for a neighbouring seat congratulated the Labor victor in the by-election for securing the seat. And a quite prominent figure in the Liberal Party in Victoria, not necessarily the most successful political faction in the country, denounced the serving Liberal member for not recognising that the Liberal Party was at war with the Labor Party. And this, I think, is a sad reflection on Australian politics. It was actually not the way in which politics was always practiced in the past. And it does suggest that although Australian politics is not in a mode of crisis, the politics of war mindset may actually at some point link up with populist political actors in such a way as creates a need for vigilance about the integrity of the political system. I don't actually think there are huge challenges that arise from the mass population, because of something I've just written about Fatima Paimon and Pauline Hanson suggests. Hansonism is an aging and probably dying phenomenon, which, if one looks at actual election results, is well on the way out. But other kinds of populism may come along at different points in the future, and if they link up with politics as war, it may lead to a situation in which the tendency towards degradation is either reinitiated or aggravated. So let me conclude with those points. I'm sorry I've ranged across such a lot of territory, but there is quite a lot in the book which details these sorts of points much more extensively. And I don't know whether it's in bookshops yet, because that tends to be a bit hit and miss, but the book itself is available from Australian Scholarly Publishing, who produced it at the website www.scholarly.info. So if anybody finds this at all interesting, it is available in more detail. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks very much, Bill. That was fascinating. I would have been happy to just let you go further on and on. It's I think another unique, very unusual feature of the Australian system is that all the journos are crammed into the same building as the politicians, and that's very unusual in other democratic countries.
Yes.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, go on.
Could I just make a comment on that? I think there's also been a change in the backgrounds of the journalists who are making their way into mass media. If one thinks back to the 1960s and the 1970s, I've mentioned my father was president of the press gallery back in 1951. Journalists had often, or principal lead journalists had often been in the position for a very long period of time and had very long memories. Whether one's talking about people like Alan Reid or Ian Fitchett, Laurie Oakes, Paul Kelly, they'd been around a long time. Whereas increasingly what one sees is chief political correspondents or active political correspondents who are very young, who won't necessarily have much personal recollection of past developments in Australian politics that may be pertinent to how one interprets or judges what's happening in the here and now. And more of them have gone through journalism degrees rather than degrees in history or politics or subjects of that sort that might ground their approach to political reporting in a fairly rich sense of political history. And I've found on occasions when I've been talking to journalists, I've had to lead them by the hand through very relevant past episodes of which they have no personal recollection whatsoever. So, sorry, Peter, I interrupted you there, but I just wanted to flag that point, sir.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose another question is the things that those journos report. I mean, as long as I've been following politics, people have complained that the press gallery is getting shallower and shallower. But was there ever a golden age when they focused predominantly on policy rather than politics? Even those greats that you mentioned, those old doyens, did they prioritise policy?
I don't think they did, but there was a difference, which was that in the 50s and the 60s, Canberra was a much smaller place. And the key journalists in the press gallery tended to be bumping into senior public servants in a whole range of different social environments, whether one's talking about the golf club or the various hotels around Canberra. People knew other people in Canberra to a much greater extent these days than these days. And so there was scope for people who were in the journalistic world to discuss policy issues with people who were really quite senior in the policy making process, without necessarily anyone being compromised by the discussion, but with the consequence that journalists often had a deeper sense of what the animating impetus behind a particular policies might have been at the time. And within Parliament House, the old Parliament House people were talking to each other all the time. There was in fact a little book club which consisted of Menzies, Chifley and Alan Reid. And they used to exchange novels and get together to talk about the books that they'd all been reading. It's inconceivable that you'd find anything like that these days.
I have a question from Michael Maley.
Oh,
Bill, you discussed the difficulties governments may face in getting legislation through the modern Senate, but there's also the issue of whether joint sittings are likely now to be of any use. Any comments?
Yes, I think not. And I do have some discussion about this because if one looks at the upshot of the double dissolution that took place under Malcolm Turnbull's prime ministership, it's very clear that the consequence was that had there been a joint sitting, the numbers would not have been there to pass the legislation on the strength of which the double dissolution had been called. And there are several reasons for that. One is that if you have only a narrow victory in the House of Representatives, and there's a large number of independent or Green senators, you may be well behind the eight ball in terms of putting the numbers together in a double dissolution. I think that's another reason why we're less and less likely to see Section 57 dissolutions taking place, because there are several reasons why you could have a double dissolution. One might be to get rid of someone from the Senate, but it's debatable how effective that might be if the effect is to cut the quota for election. You might also want to get legislation through, but if there's a low probability that you'll have the numbers in a double dissolution or be able to stare down a new Senate to get legislation adopted, then there may not be much to be said for the use of Section 57. And if one thinks back to elections where double dissolutions have been held, it's very rarely the case that the proposed legislation that actually became the trigger for the double dissolution is then the issue that dominates during the election campaign itself. 74, 75 elections were not about the legislation that actually provided the legal basis for a double dissolution.
Hmm.
It's, in the Zoom now.
Sorry, Graham?
Sorry, I'm just having troubles with Zoom. My computer just crashed.
Yes.
Do you have a question, Graham, or comment?
Well, I sort of a question comment. It relates to the idea, of electoral regulation, including finance and funding, and the idea of hollowing out of parties, which William talked about. Sorry, I noticed the new but stalled bill from Labor about election finance slipped in a very small section to say that none of this largesse, none of this regulation of parties' finances will allow the courts to be asked by members of parties to actually enforce the party rules, to ensure that the executives abide by their own rules. And this is something following on from I think a very negative High Court case a couple of years ago that undid 30 years of at least members being able to go to the courts and say in suitable cases, make the party executives abide by their own rules. Yeah. And this, I think, also relates further to an issue that without this new bill, we're still going to have the situation where the Australian Electoral Commission says you can give six-figure sums, as companies and people do, to the parties' business forums, the major parties, and you don't have to declare that. It's somehow you're getting, it's a crazy paradox. You're buying influence and access, but that somehow that makes good consideration in law so that you're not actually donating money, even though very clearly they're making super profits. And I'm thinking, you might want to comment on that, but there's two examples, I think, where you think, well, what's the point of being a member of a party when your pre-selection vote can be overridden so easily, but also where rich business people and mining companies and so on can get direct access to senior party figures, and you probably be lucky ever to meet someone who's not your local member.
Exactly. I totally agree with that. The use of intermediate recipients of donations as a way of laundering money was something that Jan Woodward and I also discussed in the submission that went to the 1983 committee, because whilst there was a lot of talk at that time about disclosure, it was very clear that the risk was that a rigorous but not sufficiently rigorous set of legislative provisions would simply give rise to intermediate bodies like the Cormac Foundation or bodies of that sort, which would launder the big donations and create a dangerous lack of transparency about exactly who was giving money to whom. And when political leaders say, well, the money goes to the party and we don't know who is contributing it, I will pull the other one. You could sell someone the Brooklyn Bridge if they'd lied by that line of argument.
Could I just follow up and say, sorry, that there is a problem here, though, in the AEC, because the law says it is a donation to the extent that you're not getting good consideration. And they're not even using their extensive powers to go in and say, look, you're making super profits. This, or if this was just a conference at an academic thing, it would cost X dollars and you're charging $150,000 a year. So the Electoral Commission, I think, has fallen down, unfortunately, on 4 or 5 years now on that very, very blatant loophole, which if not closed, then we can never have donation caps in Australia.
I'm fully in favour of closing all these kinds of loopholes. So part of the problem is that some of the measures that have been put in place with respect to the AEC in recent years have created an impression of rigorous control, which may not actually be there when one probes a bit more carefully. And some of the Section 44.1 issues highlight that. So, for example, candidates are now, if they're born overseas, will be putting in documents to the AEC with the intent of establishing that they are either not dual citizens, or if they are dual citizens, there's been no reasonable mechanism by which they could renounce that citizenship, bringing themselves within the exception that was set out in Canavan and Gallagher. I actually looked in some detail at a case of this some years ago where a candidate who was a citizen of Afghanistan lodged documents in Persian, including one with an English translation, which purported to state that she had been deprived of her Afghan citizenship. But in fact, it could only be that could only be accomplished by a decree of the president of the country. And the Persian document that she lodged, which went up on the AEC website, only said that she'd been deprived of her identity card, not of her citizenship. She didn't win a seat, so it didn't go forward for litigation. But I can see why the AEC might find itself in a real bind if it were called upon to sort of retranslate all those kind of documents and become familiar with the intricacies of citizenship law in other countries. This whole issue blew up the week before last with Pauline Hanson seeking to impugn the citizenship and eligibility to run for Parliament of Senator Fatima Paimon on entirely spurious grounds.
So is the solution, Bill, to wind back the clock 40 years, get rid of public funding, wind it back 100 years, get rid of compulsion, and the parties will be actively getting popular support?
I think there is such broad support for compulsory voting that it's probably never going to be a viable proposal to go back to voluntary voting, although some people might float it. But if one were to change the incentive structures that flow from the confluence of public funding and compulsory voting, one might actually be able to keep compulsory voting, but ameliorate some of the consequences that flow from it because of other needs for membership that might arise by virtue of changes in the funding sphere. Personally, my preference would be for a situation which I am confident will never arise, which is where there are really tight limitations on donations and no public funding, so that the only way in which parties could actually fund their activities would be by building up mass memberships and relying on those mass memberships to fund their activity. But of course, that's not going to happen. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas.
Yeah. There's
This is election 2 o'clock.
hello, Kevin Bonham, making a star appearance.
Sorry, unintended.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I mean, we now have in a situation where the party's support is so low and probably over the longer term getting lower that, political parties, at Federation, political parties as we know them didn't exist. Then in the next decade, they emerged as a very strong two-party system. And now we're back, maybe to a situation similar to the first decade of the last century, and before that in the various colonies. Is all this, it's all in the context of parties, but, might we be, talking about a system that's sort of about to virtually disappear anyway?
Well, one of the most interesting things to me is the extent to which the spectacle of independents winning seats in unprecedentedly large numbers in the 2022 election might change the way in which voters in 2025 think about the feasibility and desirability of voting for independent, because one could see why in the past, with the major parties dominating the selection of people to go to the Senate and the House, people might think, well, I really like that particular candidate, but there's no particular point in voting for him or her because it would be a wasted vote. But when you get to the point where you can see quite a number of electorates where the vote hasn't actually been wasted but has contributed to the election of an independent of the Parliament, then that may begin to change the disposition towards supporting independence that in 2022 kept people still with the major parties. I don't know. I think it's a completely open question whether that will happen or not. But I wouldn't be surprised myself if some of the major party candidates got a big surprise in 2025. And that may well have underpinned Paul Fletcher's decision to look for greener pastures. I actually, given that the Australian election study suggested that some of the Teal independent success arose from strategic voting, it may well be that the Labor Party will also be vulnerable here in some of its seats, as we saw in Fowler. If the Liberals are bright enough to realise that running dead and instead handing their preferences to a credible independent may prove to be a device for ejecting a Labor candidate or even a Labor minister.
Sure. We are the Australian setup of having single-member electorates in the lower house and PR in the upper house is very unusual in the democratic world. And I think that it's an unsung villain in the last really 15 or so years of when people lament the lack of reform. I think the Senate is a big factor in that. The governments of old had pretty easy Senates, especially they either had majorities or they had the Democrats, a one-stop shop, and the Democrats were self-consciously centrist. But now, if Labor wants to get anything through, they've got to get the Greens plus a couple of others. When the coalition's in government, they've recently needed One Nation and others, and it's just very difficult. It's a very powerful Senate, also by international standards. Do you have any comments on that, Bill?
I think that's absolutely true. And what it does do is put a premium on the negotiating skills of the leader of the government in the Senate to be able to deal with potentially fractious crossbenchers as a way of securing the passage of legislation through the Parliament. And historically, one didn't necessarily see that as a critical element of the skill set of the leader of the government in the Senate. But now I think it is. And if we talk to people around Canberra, particularly people who are close to the crossbenchers, you will hear people say, for example, that Senator Cormann was much better at doing negotiations with people on the crossbench than Senator Abetz was when he was leader of the government in the Senate. My sense is that Senator Wong and Senator and some of the minor party senators probably have relatively congenial relations, but it's also time consuming. If to get legislation through the Senate, you don't just have to deal with one minor party where you might do a bit of trading across issues, but you need to assemble, in effect, an ad hoc coalition to secure the adoption or the passage of a piece of legislation. Then you run the risk that the concession that you might make to one party may be a red line for some other actor that you need to get on board. And that makes the negotiation of the passage of legislation a more challenging kind of problem than it might have been even in the days when it was essentially either the DLP before the 1974 double dissolution or the Democrats during the period of Don Chipp's ascendancy. I think it is going to be difficult. And it may well be that if there's a minority government in the House of Representatives as well, rather than striking a deal with the Labor Party, the crossbenchers might simply conclude that it's more in their interest to avoid the kind of risk of contamination that Tony Windsor and Oakeshott confronted, and say, well, test your strength on the floor of the Parliament on both supply and individual items of legislation. That'll be a bargaining challenge. But it may actually lead to legislative outcomes that the general public finds more satisfactory. It's a fascinating time to be living.
Have a comment from Marion Saw. My objection to the concept of strategic voting is that it assumes people are really Liberal or really Labor voters and are just voting differently to achieve some limited purpose. I don't think anyone should assume that kind of party loyalty anymore.
Yes, Marion, I agree with that. I think when one talks about strategic voting, one's certainly not talking about parties being able to move blocks of voters, because the most that they can do is actually issue a how to vote card or try to send covert signals to potential supporters about how they should distribute their preferences. But in order to take a seat away from the major party and perhaps get it to a teal independent, it may not be necessary to accomplish a shift of an entire bloc, but simply a situation in which enough individual voters decide that, for example, in Wentworth, there's never going to be a Labor candidate elected, so the best thing to do is vote in such a way as gives the Liberal incumbent a bloody nose. And there are sort of covert ways that can be signalled if a major party candidate decides not to campaign in any significant fashion at all. But it's certainly not the case that parties can control this situation absolutely, but there are sort of sneaky ways in which they can try to produce that kind of outcome.
Yes, Ben Rowie asks, can he make a comment? Yes, he can either do it in text or...
Thanks. Sorry, I missed the start of this, but thanks for putting this on. I was actually going to say something else, but about the strategic voting, I do think it's quite easy to identify that there are blocks of people who would, in a traditional context, vote for the Labor or the Greens, but instead of voting for the Teals. And I think the bit that we can't interpret, it's very hard to understand at least, is are they doing that because they like the Teal better and now there's a better option that wasn't previously available, or are they doing it because of that calculation that my preferred candidate can't win? And in this case, this calculation, and this is a thing that's becoming much more common now, that because we have these races, a lot more races where there's kind of a competition for second place, and depending on who comes second, they might be competitive to win or not. There's value for a lot more voters in thinking strategically about that. Whereas the kind of old system where you would have two clear leaders and you could either vote for them or you could vote for someone else and give them their preferences, you didn't need to worry very much about the distribution of preferences and the order in which they were excluded. And now you do.
I'm sorry, just on that,
go ahead.
My suspicion is that the next iteration of the Australian election study will probably include some questions that are designed to try to tease this out much more, because it wasn't sort of contemplated.
I don't think that's going to happen.
You don't think it happened, Jill?
Sorry, I won't raise expectations now. We're squeezing a lot in.
There's an idea for 2028.
I think both Marion and Ben are kind of right here that there is a group that but for the hollowing out of parties would be Liberal Labor or Greens voters, and we know that demographically. Parties are hollowed out. The dimensions on which the parties appeal to us ideologically are out of alignment, and probably for some of the people who, air quotes, voted strategically, some of them probably wouldn't have voted for the Teals, but that they seemed like a viable option. Some probably have a new home. And we probably won't know for 3 election cycles, right?
That's why it would be really good to start asking questions that would tease that out.
Oh, I agree.
Sorry, Ben. An idea for 2028. I thought an interesting example of that was looking at the difference between the ACT Senate in 2022 and the ACT Legislative Assembly in 2024. Clearly, there is a kind of person who likes the idea of a centrist-ish, someone centrist but progressive on climate change type candidate. But I think in a lot of cases, the Teals who got elected in the federal election. It was a creature of the single member electorate. But the other point I wanted to make was in reference to the Senate and the complications of it, because when I look at the relationship between Labor and the Greens now, Labor doesn't have a problem like they did in 2008, where they would need to get Steve Fielding to agree with the Greens and Nick Xenophon to pass legislation. You know, the Greens, David Pocock, were broadly enough on the same political page that it's not that hard to see things that they could all agree upon. One thing I find fascinating, and I think it's been more of a problem than I expected it to be, is that Labor and the Greens have incentives to not agree with each other. Labor has incentives to avoid a situation where the Greens can take credit for getting things done. Greens have an incentive for showing that they are responsible for things getting done and not just voting for government legislation. And it creates this pressure where they both posture, but they do want to get stuff done, both on its merits and because they want to be seen to be doing stuff. So they eventually compromise, but I feel like we've been seeing more than I expected situations where the posturing dominates and they never get to that compromise at the end. And I think that a lot of that is because the Greens are competitive in the House, and frankly, the Greens can't really make any gains in the Senate. They're pretty much at their limit. That in the House, there is that incentive for them to be in conflict. And I mean, it would be interesting if they were in a governing relationship, because I think the incentives would then change. But as long as they're in the kind of relationship they're in now, I think, you know, even when you get progressive majorities in the Senate, Labor and the Greens have this, you know, and Albanese, I think Albanese is an extreme case of this, because I think Albanese personally has big problems with the Greens that probably are more significant than they are for his colleagues. But, you know, he very much is aware of the fact that he doesn't want the Greens to be able to say, see, we can get stuff done too.
Yeah. Well, it's in a way, I think it's a classic example of product differentiation, really. And it may be the case that the decision of the Greens in the ACT not to continue in coalition with the Labor Party, even though it took them out of ministerial office, may reflect a sense that the election of Thomas Emerson from the electorate in which I vote, incidentally, in the ACT, suggests that they're at risk if they become part of a governing team of being seen as lacking a distinctive identity, which provides a basis for them then to solicit votes from the general public. In terms of I think you're right about the dynamic within the Senate and with Albanese, and this is one of the cases, I think, where you can argue that it's a case of cutting off one's nose to spite one's face. If you, for example, look at the National Anti-Corruption Commission, the numbers would have been there for a really tough anti-corruption commission, and the numbers probably would not have been there in the foreseeable future for any coalition government to try to rescind the attributes that made for a tough anti-corruption commission. Now, the one explanation may be that Labor feared a tough anti-corruption commission just as much as the Liberals would. But another would be that they got hooked on the notion of not appearing to give in to the Greens, and together with a rather naive notion that you create durable institutions by letting the opposition water down what it is that you initially proposed. But I think it's been detrimental from the government's point of view, in that the weaknesses of the National Anti-Corruption Commission are very obviously on display as a result of the rejection of the robo-debt referral from the Royal Commissioner, and together with the problems that have afflicted the chosen commissioner since then. And when that's the case, you begin to wonder whether bipartisanship with the major opposition party has anything really going for it, if it's at the expense of some characteristics of legislation that would make that legislation appealing to the public and therefore a source of support at some point in the future.
I just want to throw in a caveat that Labor and the Greens do disagree on a lot of things as well. So it's not just a dance about two progressive parties. And I think a big example of that was a long time ago, but the Malaysia solution. They have very different attitudes to that sort of thing. Michael wanted to speak.
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I think one point that's worth picking up on in the change that we've seen is simply the decline in the number of safe seats and in the House of Representatives, and reflecting now on the fact that there's even speculation that Bradfield could come under threat. When I first started working on elections, Bradfield, it was inconceivable that Bradfield could be won by anyone but a Liberal. In fact, until up until the by-election with multiple candidates in Bradfield, there had never been a need for a distribution of preferences to determine the result in the seat in 40 years or something like that. So that then has implications for the way in which parties operate as patronage networks, because if you don't really have any safe seats, except for the number 1 and number 2 positions on your Senate ticket, that really diminishes the power of people who see themselves as power brokers, numbers men, factional leaders, whatever, to hand out these safe seats to their supporters and consolidate their positions in the caucuses. And I suspect this is one of the reasons why Senator Farrell has been so emphatic in his enthusiasm for the two-party system, as expressed in recent interviews. Going back on that, it also seems to me that in many ways the rise of the Teals has parallels in the rise of the DLP in the 1950s, in that they represent to a significant extent a split in the Liberal Party, but it's a split at the grassroots level rather than at the parliamentary level. We haven't seen Liberals walking out and becoming Teals to a great extent. There have been, some cases of people who've departed. That then puts the parties really in a bit of a bind, because on the one hand, if they want to preserve the role as a patronage network, they have to go one way. But if they want to respond to the sort of public opinion that is clearly coming through, that's showing a dissatisfaction with the way in which politics has evolved, they need to go another way. And it seems to me, particularly the current government, is stuck halfway down the wicket on that.
And part of the difficulty that the major parties could face here is that if you're trying to wind back from a situation which has tended towards patronage networks to something like a mass party, it's not something that can happen quickly, because people get out of the habit of joining political parties, and because the smell tends to linger. One thinks of the comment that John Randolph of Roanoke made about Edward Livingston, like rotten mackerel by moonlight, he shines and stinks. And a lot of people who in the past might have joined political parties for social reasons have alternative mechanisms for engagement, up to including social media and the kind of satisfaction that can provide for them. A statistic I saw, which was a fairly startling one, is that the Labor Party nationwide now has fewer members than the Hellenic Club in Woden in Canberra. And I suspect that is probably true of all the major parties. At one stage, I think the Nationals had the largest membership, because simply social activity in some rural areas was still based around going to party meetings. But whether that's actually been sustained, I don't know, because the parties are so secretive about their membership numbers. Michael Yabsley, in a newspaper article, estimated the Liberal membership at between 40 and 50,000. It's not a huge membership, and it's probably an aging membership. If you just look at photographs that come out of speeches being made by party leaders to the faithful, the faithful, they're not young and frisky, put it that way.
Well, any more questions or comments?
Peter, it's Graham. I'm just struggling with the Zoom app. Once it's in safe driving mode, you're really trapped.
I can hear you.
If you can hear me, yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So I just wondered, could we broaden this a bit? Because I know, Michael, you're an internationalist, comparativist, and others in the room know a lot more about overseas comparable democracies, but there is still something quite sticky about the Australian party system. And I've often wondered, to what extent is it because of certain structural things we have, like compulsory voting, public funding per dollar vote, majoritarian lower houses, and so on, which, obviously UK has, and that's propping up the Tories and Labour. And we don't have primaries, so you can't do a Trump and turn the Liberal Party into a populist nationalist party so easily. But also wonder, is it because also Australia is a lucky country and that fits compulsory voting, and people genuinely are, as you said, not unhappy with democracy, even if they're unhappy with parties. And, we're an island nation with significant primary and tertiary resources, and that's more of an explanation for the relative stability compared to, France and many other countries where party realignment has happened relatively strongly, if not quickly.
I think it also has something to do with the prevalence of preferential voting in the House of Representatives. If one looks at a country like Israel, where the political system has been extraordinarily fluid, the very strict proportional system that's used to elect the Knesset is probably one of the reasons of that. Someone can break away as a disgruntled leader from a political party, and as long as they get over a threshold, they'll still have a political career, because all governments there are being assembled from fragments of different parties in a highly fragmented political space. That also suggests that simply the historical experience of having the coalition and the Labor Party emburdens the efforts of other people to break in the system. And I remember Frank McManus, the DLP senator, who had been the state secretary of the Labor Party in Victoria before the split, saying once that a minor party had to get up or get out. And that, I think, for a very long time was the impression that people had about the operation of the party system. Whether that will actually survive if there's a House of Representatives election that actually produces a minority government without a coalition agreement between the government and the crossbench, I think is an open question, really. Certainly the data on party identification suggests that fewer and fewer young people are identifying with political parties in the way that the older generation did. In fact, some of the data from the 2022 Australian election study are quite startling in that respect. And that, I think, is something that keeps party bosses awake at night.
On that,
I think
people talk about the end of ideology, and David Kemp back in the 1970s was writing about the decline of class-based voting in Australia and a shift towards voting based on values, and we've seen that since with the rise of parties that don't fit neatly into that old sort of left-right divide. My sense, for what it's worth, is there are also structural factors in that it's getting harder and harder to register parties, just in terms of the number of members that you have to come up with. If you're not a parliamentary party, that's gone up over the years. And the fact that you may be able to get a political profile at the federal level doesn't necessarily mean you can replicate it at the state level, or vice versa, because the issues are not going to be the same. And some of those factors may also make it harder. And certainly, if you compare it with countries which have nationwide list proportional representation with a fairly low threshold, like East Timor, you're much more likely to get parties based around particular individuals or particular ethnic groups or something like that. A lot depends on what are the cleavages within the society as to whether there's something that someone dissatisfied with a major party can actually use as a basis for an appeal in a different context.
Yeah, I'd share one. This is highly impressionistic, but it simply arises from discussions with various people who've sought to lobby the Teals. That those who've gone in to lobby the Teals, it seems, come out of the meetings with a sense that the members with whom they were engaging were really interested in what they had to say and listening carefully to what they had to say. Whereas the same people, when they had lobbied people from major parties, very often came with the feeling that they weren't really listening and that their responses were simply regurgitating the standard dot point notes on a particular issue that the party leadership had circulated. And ordinary people can spot a mile off if a politician with whom they're seeking to engage is simply reflecting back the views of the party leadership. And I suspect a lot of people have found that refreshing. Whether it makes any difference when it comes to aggregate votes, who knows? But it's one reason why people might be attracted to the idea of independent ones. Already hearing that kind of thing about David Pocock in the Senate from the ACT and also Thomas Emerson in the ACT Assembly.
Bill, I just wanted to agree with, your comment about disenchantment with the major parties, but it's extraordinary the degree to which our electoral systems do prop up the position of the major parties. I mean, if you can win 33% of the vote and get, over 50% of the seats, you're significantly advantaged.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So it's that's why I think what we're looking at are trends rather than things that are going to happen instantly and dramatically. There's still a lot of people who will vote for the same party throughout their lives, but that proportion of the electorate has been steadily declining, and over time it becomes more and more dramatic. And I do have some discussion in the book of some social developments that might account for that, really. So immigration is one, that you have people who are Australian citizens who are voting in elections, but whose personal experiences don't create a situation in which they are expected by their parents or their families to vote for a particular political party. That's one change that's occurred, with 50%, more than 50% of the population, according to the last census, being made up either of people born overseas or with parents overseas. The mechanisms of socialisation into loyalty to a particular major party have been weakening over time. And that, in a sense, is one reason why these tendencies, I think, are progressive rather than dramatic instant shifts. But it's not clear that the major parties have ways of dealing with this. And I think it's partly because they don't necessarily understand the social complexities of the more recently arrived people. And just to give you an example, which is from my background as a specialist on Afghanistan, the Liberal Party has selected as its candidate for Bruce somebody who was born in Afghanistan, but they haven't twigged that he is from a different ethnic group from that which the bulk of the Australian citizens of Afghan refugees background belong. Now he's a Pashtun. The bulk of the Afghan Australians living in the Dandenong area where he's running for parliament are Hazaras, who historically have regarded the Pashtuns as oppressors. So I suspect the Labor candidate was licking his lips. The Liberals pre-selectors may have been licking their lips too, but perhaps prematurely.
And with that, the clock has struck 2 p.m. Unless anyone has some quick questions or comments. Anyone? I declare this wonderful seminar closed. Thanks so much, Bill. It was really, really fascinating. And thanks so much for all the contributions. And we will say goodbye and have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much for your hospitality. It's a pleasure to join the network's discussion.